Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to have you all here. Of course, I think we'd rather have met in Ifri. That would have been nicer, but COVID-19 decided otherwise, and so we are on Zoom as is now a new habit, so to speak. But well, to see the bright side of life, it allows us to attract people from further away, and so that's I think a rather positive aspect. So depending on where you are, good morning or good afternoon, it depends. We have people in many different time zones. Anyway, so this morning we'll be discussing the role of South Korea in the Indo-Pacific. But before we do that, I have to remind you of a couple of details. The first thing is that you can ask your questions through the Q&A thread, which is at the bottom of your screen. I guess you're now used to this kind of practice. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we will have 2 sessions in a row, but there will be a short break in the middle. During this break, you may do whatever you want, of course, but do not disconnect yourself. Just well, mute yourself or switch off your camera if you are on screen, but do not disconnect yourself. Just come back 15 minutes later and everybody will be back as well. So that's an important aspect. Do not disconnect yourself. I think that there will also be some kind of this sent to you after the event to assess your satisfaction of the event. For the time being, this questionnaire is only in French, but I think we're working on the English version. So I hope that we'll have the 2 versions at the end of the seminar. So depending on your language, you'll be sent the questionnaire in either language. Okay, in terms of logistics, I think that's about it. I don't think I forgot anything. If ever I did, Céline Pajon will take over during the break and remind you of the other organizational details. So that's not too much of a problem if I forgot anything. Okay, and now I will hand over to Christophe André, who will be moderating the first session on the economic dimension of the new Southern policy and the economic presence of Korea in the region. So Christophe, the floor is yours, and I mute myself for some time.
Thank you, Françoise. Good morning to everybody. And first, many thanks to Ifri and Francois Nicola for inviting me to moderate this session. This webinar is very timely following the signing of the RCEP agreement between the 10 Asian countries and China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand last Sunday. And the US election, which is also likely to affect trade relationships in Asia and globally. Among other issues, it could affect the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. Many observers argue that if the US decided to join, Korea may follow, but we are not there yet. Korea's new Southern policy launched by President Moon Jae-in 3 years ago is one of the key elements of South Korea's diplomacy. In a period of rising international tensions dominated by the US-China competition for technological supremacy, but not limited to it, it is essential for South Korea to diversify its trade and investments. ASEAN is a fast-growing market of over 600 million people. Many Korean companies have redirected part of their outsourcing from China to Asian countries recently, in particular to Vietnam, both because of increasing labor costs in China and political tensions in the wake of the 2017 installation of the THAAD anti-ballistic missile defense system. Most Asian countries, as well as India, which has not joined the RCEP so far, face a number of challenges, including upgrading their infrastructure, which is key to fostering sustainable growth, and further raising labor productivity and standards of living. Korea has strong technical expertise and some financial capabilities to develop infrastructure. It is a leader in the 4th industrial revolution based on digitalization, which Asian countries need to embrace to create comparative advantages beyond low labor costs. This raises a number of questions. what is Korea's contribution in terms of infrastructure financing in Asia and India? How are the Korean players acting to promote Industry 4.0 as the new priority target for economic cooperation? What are the expectations and position of Korea regarding RCEP and CPTPP? To address these issues, we have two distinguished speakers. Lee Chon-yeol is a professor of economics at Korea University in Sejong. He got his PhD in economics from the Ohio State University and worked at the Korea Institute of Finance as a research fellow before moving to the university. He has been Dean of the College of Business and Economics and of the College of Public Policy in Korea University at Sejong. He has studied financial markets and industry and SME finance in developing countries and Korea for several decades. He wrote papers such as Financial Accessibility and Economic Growth, Assessing the Financial Landscape for the Association of Southern Asian Nations Economic Community, Profitability on Corporation Banks in Asia, and many others. He also participated in many projects to develop the financial markets and industry in developing countries such as Guatemala, Honduras, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Nepal, Nigeria, Thailand, and others. He edited several books, notably Asian-Korea Relations, 25 Years of Partnership and Friendship, as well as Partnership for Tomorrow, Asian-Korea Relations. Francois Nicola is a senior researcher and director at the Center for Asian Studies at Ifri in Paris. She teaches at Sciences Po Paris, Sciences Po Lyon, and is a consultant to the OECD with a focus on Southeast Asian non-member economies. She holds a PhD in international economics and an MA in political science from the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. She has also studied at the University of Sussex and was a visiting fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore and at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy in Seoul. Her research focuses on development strategies and regional economic integration in East Asia, foreign direct investment and growth, and emerging economies and globalization. Her latest publications include Korea in Africa, Between Soft Power and Economic Interests, as well as France, China, and the BRI, The Challenge of Conditional Engagement, in a forthcoming book on the European Union and China's Belt and Road Initiative. So let's now turn to our first speaker, Professor Lee. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. When I give my short bio, I didn't expect you read everything in this my bio. I just like to read about 2 or 3 lines, but you read about 10 lines. It's too long. I mean, okay, I'm going to say something on the Korea's policy. This is I think that you can see. Can you see it on the screen? Okay, here. Actually, you asked me several questions. Some of them I include as Korea's new policy. At the same time, some of the important one is about RCEP, which was a few days ago. It was made in this year. So that I'm going to say something which I prepared, which is on the new southern policy of Korea. And later part, I'm going to give an answer of the RCEP by itself. First of all, I think that most of you never heard about this word, new southern policy, that of Korea. So that's what I'm going to say something on here. Here's the introduction, and what is the new southern policy of Korea, and what is it need, and what is the accomplishment. And at the same time, when he signed the RCEP, at the same time, Korean president announced a new southern policy plus. So what's the meaning of new southern policy pluses and before the new southern policy? That's what I'm going to do. So it was about 3 years ago, the newly elected Korean president Moon Jae-in declared the new southern policy in December 2017. When you say this something, the people are very confused. What is the meaning? Why he says of the southern here? Actually, the South Asia and India was located in the south of Korea. So we may say that we're going to emphasize the southern countries. But the more important one is that he said that India and ASEAN countries countries will be regarded as a four giant. I mean, the giant means China, Japan, Russia, and United States. They are the key major company in the world who, I mean, they have an influence of the Korean politics and economics and blah, 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 blah. So that what is the meaning of these, what said the relationship with the ASEAN and India should be as big as the four big giants. So at that time, people did not recognize the importance, but as time goes by, we build up a strategy and detailed program. And finally, 2 years later, we get some accomplishment. That's what I'm going to ask you to say something here, okay? What I try to say is that the meaning of this is this. For the past 70 years after Korea, actually Korea became independent in 1945 after World War II. And we have a government in 48. As you see that we are divided by North Korea and South Korea. Then we have a war, 3 years of civil war from North Korea and South Korea. Since then, Korea's diplomatic policies always was the same, to secure the national security. So the reason why we have the war, the 3 years of war, is that there are big giants were surrounding Korea, the United States and Russia at the time, also Soviet Union, and People's Republic of China. I mean, maybe one of the countries who made the World War II was Japan. So we are always surrounded that the national security is the most important issue at the time here. However, as the time go on, we begin to realize what is the more important country in terms of economic benefit. There have been a gap showing up again and again. So we have to rebalance those of the weight. Let me show you some interesting statistics here. This is the dark bar here, that the shares of aid, I mean aid from foreign country to the total government revenue in 1950, just after Korean War. As you see, the 1956, that was a 46.5, which means that half of the Korean government revenue was the aid, in particular from the United States. So we are heavily rely upon everything on the United States here. That was the fact. So then most of the foreign ministers and government president have to looking at the country of the United States to get some here. That was a story in 50s. And 60s, we have to launch an economic development plan, and we have to show good performance at the time. At the time, 1965, I mean, looking at the end of this 1965, the trade ratio between US is about 40%. Trade ratio about Japan is 35%, which means that almost 70% of Korea trade was allocated by US and Japan. At the time, the Japan is overcome its war, and at that time, there's been a booming area. In other words, so how to Korea became a developed country, I mean, developing Korea is heavily rely on the trade two big countries of US and Japan. So then we have to looking at the US and Japan, so that two of the big giants. As you can see in this graph is the share of the US and Japan continues to fall down. As you see, you had a red line here, that is a 1990, where the Korea has formal diplomatic relationship with ASEAN. And you have the horizontal line, this dot line, which is 50%. Exactly that year, the ratio of trade between US and Japan counted about 50% and later going down and down. As you can see here, these graphs show the trade between region and countries is more classified here. In 1990, the US is 27%, Japan is 23%. But if you look at the 2018, about 35 years later, it turns out that US trade relations is only 11 points. Japan was 23, now it's only 80. Less than 20% has trade is made by US and Japan. So the rate of the US and Japan has continued to fall. However, China takes about 23% of Korea's trade. ASEAN take care of the 14%. In other words, the trade relationship has moved from US and China to the, US and Japan to the China and ASEAN. In particular, China is very important for the after year 2000 today, but there has been some important movement was made here. China's economic bloc policy caused by the installment of a THAAD. I mean, the THAAD is people are not familiar with. It's a terminal high altitude air defense system, which means it's a kind of missile system here, was of the United States Army, was installed in Korea. That was and China said it's a problem with the national security, and they make a block of the Korean economy. That's one of the largest retail group of Lotte Group. They have many department store and maybe convenience stores that they have closed down 112 stores in China and 2017 only here. They lost about 1.4 billion US dollars. At the same time, the number of Chinese tourists fell from 8.1 million person in 2016 to the 4.2 million. In other words, it became half. So many Korean tourist companies and many Korean stores who take care of these hotels and having big troubles here. At the same time, they block Korean movie and Korean music theater. The stars have a concert at the time. So people recognize the so-called China list. And even before, many Korean companies consider relocating their production facility from China to other countries. Why? Because the GDP per capita of China reached $10,000. Korean company recognize the high wages. High wages, they're not good for the Korean company. So that several things happen, and Korean has to reevaluate the importance of ASEAN countries, as well as the Indian too here. So that the meaning of this is that Korea new southern policy is a rebalancing policy to reduce the gap between political weight and economic weight. Because although the economic weight has been changed from 4 big giants to the maybe southern countries of South Asian countries, but we didn't put on the balance on the diplomatic policy. So that we're going to put more emphasis on these new southern countries, not only for the economic weighted, but also for the political weighted, diplomatic weighted here. And many economic figures show that rising trend of trade, financial activity, and number of travelers between Korea and ASEAN for the past 3 years. Actually, the ratio of trade between ASEAN and Korea is about 14% for 3 years. I mean, the 14.1 to the 14.7 doesn't matter. And also, Korean government try to find what kind of impression Korea has to give to these countries, and they make some kind of survey. I mean, there are some annual survey, there are new survey, and so then they found that the ASEAN people recognize the importance of Korean. At the same time, from the Korean side, they recognize the importance of ASEAN. They begin to evaluate the ASEAN here. So why these all these things are important? Why the impression from Korea to ASEAN, ASEAN to Korea is important? It has related the new way of cooperation here. I mean, until now, on about 1990s, 80s, 90s, and 2000, we are focusing on the trade. The trade means we build something in Korea, we sell to other countries, then that's it. Most of the trade is done by within the territory of Korea and done by it. However, after 2000, we began to build up a value changes, which was already done in maybe other European country, and Japan has been 1980s here. We think that what we can do is different from what it has to do. So we began to like specialize something and began to work with ASEAN people together. So that we have to relocate our companies from factories in Korea and Japan, Korea and China and other countries, in particular the South Asian countries. We said that here. But however, there is some problem. If you're looking at the map of South Korea, it is surrounded by the sea. And northern part of South Korea is North Korea, so it is impossible to go out. The only way to go out from South Korea is flight. In other words, South Korea is like an island. At the same time, for 1,000 years, Koreans have never been out of countries. We are very homogeneous people. We are very, maybe close-minded people like this. But today is different. So that mind is that if you like to cooperate with other countries, we have to know themselves. At the same time, we have to open our mind. That is a key aspect of, I think, the new Southern policy. In other words, right, we have to more communication, more knowledge, more background is sharing with each other. Actually, for 1,000 years, we have never been before. That was, I think, the most important of Koreans. I mean, for business cases, to sell something, to buy something, that was a 20th century. In 21st century, we have to have communicated, share the idea, and cooperate together, which never happened before. Formally, we have to, for the fast developing areas, period, we learn something from the US and Europe and Japan. Now, we are going to share something with these countries with our mind. So that New Southern Policy's idea is we call it 3P. The first one is people here, and prosperity, and peace is there. But formally, Korea's policy was always emphasized peace, meaning the security of this country. But now on, we are focusing on the people first. That means that we are going to communicate with it. That is the most important issue. The question is that with this new Southern policy will be sustainable in the future, maybe we think that it's going to be sustainable for at least 5 or 10 years, 5 years, because it will give the benefit to both sides. Both sides means Korea and ASEAN and Indian side. So why this? Let me show this. For the Korean side, ASEAN is very promising area. It has been, as you can see here, this graph show that here the growth rate for 10 years is from 1990 to the annual project of 2024. ASEAN is always showed a very stable high growth rate, which means that we have is a very good market. And also they have a very high saving rate, which means that they are very promising in ASEAN cases. And they have a very young people here, about 50% of people's ages from 20 to 54. It means that we need, Korea is moving to the maybe aging society. We need some workers, these young people. And their high school enrollment is rising very quickly, which means that their productivity increase very fast, which is what they are providing is what we are needing. So that as for the Korean side, ASEAN is the perfect places to cooperate it. At the same time, as you can see this map here, ASEAN is the close area to Korea. Just in the Vietnam case, it's just 4.5 hours of flight. Most of the ASEAN countries is 5 hours of flight is enough. So that the closest region in the world to Korea is ASEAN. And from the ASEAN side we have a lot of things Korea has a lot of things to give. Then the first question is, can China, Japan, some European country may replace the Korea? Korea has some very unique things to share with the ASEAN needs there, something too special. What is also special? Which is this. This is a GDP per capita from 1953 to the year 2018 or 19 here. As you can see, it has increased from almost $80 to the $30,000 US. That means that we have experiences every development stages for past 50 years. For example, as for me, I am about 60 years old. When I visited Vietnam GDP per capita is about $2,000, $3,000. I can remember when I was in high school days. When I visited Malaysia is about $10,000 US. That means it's similar to the about 2000, 2005 when I was working in the university early days. So in other words, I can share my feeling and my knowledge with themselves, which is quite unique, which is different from the other developed countries, which is different from the European countries or Japan cannot do that here. That is the thing that we can share my feelings and my knowledge. I can provide my knowledge. That's the industrial production ratio of Korea from 1960 to 2015. So the Korea was formerly 60s was 40% of GDP was agriculture. That means agriculture-oriented country. Believe it or not, today is people say that Korea is strong in the ICT and fourth industrial revolution. However, when I was young, most of people living in outside the town and more the agriculture, most of the people are farmers. That was a story which I can share those people in Indonesia or Vietnam and other countries. And also that's the thing here. In 1960s and 80s, the most important industry was the textile, which is the same as the Vietnam and maybe Cambodia today. So that as times go by, we change our industrial structure every 10 years and 5 years and go on here, then we can share, we can give something. In other words, we call it appropriate technology here. But the Cambodian people need technology. It's not a technology is given in the Japan. The Vietnam people, the technology, what they need is different from the technology which is the United States can give. So that kind of thing we can do ourselves, and they are appreciative of this thing. What they are doing is that they are in the middle-income traps. As you can see here, at about late 1990 and during the Asian financial crisis, they have in the middle-income traps. And about early 2010 to 2016, they have a middle-income traps, which means that for 5 years, their income did not increase. So that Korea has experienced those things. How we overcome the middle-income trap in several times is we can share our knowledge with them. I'm not saying that they can apply, they can copy the exact same policy which they did before. I'm just saying that we give some idea, we make some example. Maybe it's upon them here. They can take ours or not here. So that the last question will be: will this honeymoon go well in the long run? I think the short run is okay, but in the long run it may or may not here. It depends on what both policies in the near future here. Currently, I said in the short run, they are both benefits to what's going on here. But in the long run, story may be different. Some countries will be developed, maybe for example, Singapore and Malaysia, maybe develop more than Korea sometimes, but they don't need Korea anymore. However, there are 650 million people. Still, there are some people in ASEAN countries, so in India, need Korea's technology and cooperation. So that it may be changed, but I think that it will go sometimes, at least in some countries, in ASEAN countries. And 5 or 10 years later, for example, Malaysia maybe go to the developer stage of Korea, maybe today here. But we may need a new area partnership. But I think that if you do if we build up a new area partnership, it will go on. I think that there may be no problem on this issue. So that is a first part. So one more thing I'd like to say is that when I visited the ASEAN countries here, I was very surprised that they think that Korea is a large country. Korea has a lot of money here, but that is not true. We can see here, land size of South Korea is about only 20% of Japan, about 25% of Thailand. Population is not so big here. So what we can do is different from what they are asking. So I just have to, explain what we can do is different here. For example, a Belt and Road is impossible for me to do. In Korea, cannot make any kind of highway or railroad. We cannot do it. Maybe ICT cooperation, we can do it. EBDCs, we have one of the best in EBDC network program and everything here. However, when they need a kind of maybe equipment, ICT infrastructure, they are very low. A broadband subscription, internet is very low, but we can give equipment. No, we cannot do that because we are so small countries. One day have, but what we can do is maybe we can give some infrastructure such as a software, for example, law and regulation. We can do it, help them. Maybe education, which is one of them important one here we can provide. As you can see, this is a case in 1970 when I was in the high school here. Only 20% of people can enter the high school. Now it's about 90%, which is similar to the case of Cambodia even today here. That's what I'm going to emphasize, how to increase education, how to increase enrollment of some countries. Those are how to improve the R&D infrastructure. These we can do. So what we are able to provide, maybe different from what you are asking, but we just continuously working together and have some kind of middle point there. Okay, that's my conclusion. New Southern policy is very meaningful to Korea. It's almost first foreign policy. First, remember that. First foreign policy is that. It is important because we are first focused on the other area rather than Korean Peninsula. And also it's a rebalancing policy, I said. It has been successfully implemented for 3 years. And a few days ago, Korean president said, New Southern policy. That means we are going to continue this New Southern policy, but we're going to change include more items. We're going to get rid of items. For example, like COVID-19, they need more healthcare services, and we can provide it. And we saw and also recent changes in China and US relationship, we're going to have another way of cooperation with the ASEAN countries. These are the small adjustments from the New Southern policy, but the New Southern policy will continue for the country. And also, one of the questions was RCEP here. RCEP was not prepared in this slide, but I like said that RCEP is very important for some countries, but it's not as important as the case of Korea. In the global cases, RCEP is very important because maybe 30% of countries and population in the world are 15 countries, 30% of population, 30 country GDP of the world GDP getting to have a kind of free trade area zones. However, from the viewpoint of Korea already have all these 13% free trade areas. ASEAN, we already did in 2007 here, and China, we already did it, and in Australia, we already did it, and New Zealand, we already did it. The only country we didn't have FTA was Japan. That was related to some political relationship with Korea and Japan. So that from viewpoint of Korea, RCEP does not mean a lot of things. Practically here, but it's very meaningful that here, for 15 countries making a mega FTA, so that they confirm the direction how the East Asian countries or ASEAN, including Oceania, is going to move direction. That's very important. From the South Korean viewpoint, the only new country is Japan. So that's the impact on the Korean economy is relatively small. That's the thing here. Okay, even as I show in the screen said that trade relations with Japan is less than 8% in case of here, so that their impact. But I think that the country to get the biggest impact was Japan, because Japan did not have a FTA with China. Japan did not have a FTA with Korea. They only have ASEAN and other countries. So from Korea's viewpoint, which is a little bit from the outside people that are watching, that's what I like to emphasize. I think it's almost time's up, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for this fascinating presentation. And now I'll give the floor to Francois Nicola immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Christophe, and thank you, Professor Lee, for this very clear presentation about the New Southern policy. Well, what I will be doing is taking a more general perspective. I'll be taking the perspective from the outside observer. And so my point is to look at the current reality, the current situation between Korea and the two big partners south, which are ASEAN and India. Professor Lee, can you mute your mic? Because otherwise we hear you. Oops, I can't move from, oops. How come I cannot? Okay, well, not very convenient. Yeah, so what I'll be doing is provide some elements about the context of the New Southern policy. So I'll be looking at the current economic situation between Korea and its two partners, ASEAN and India. And for that, I will focus on two major variables, which is official development assistance, ODA, as well as outward direct investment from Korea to these two partners, ODI. So these will be the two metrics I'll be using to assess this situation. And then I will provide my personal assessment of the chances for the New Southern policy based on the observations of the current reality. So, and the question I will address is this New Southern policy all that new? And on this very specific point, I will to a large extent concur with what has just been said by Professor Lee. And then I will also try to assess the chances of success of the New Southern policy, given what is already in existence. And I'll finally try to highlight the specificity, the uniqueness of Korea in the region, and what are Korea's assets in the region in trying to implement this New Southern policy. Okay, so about the current situation, what do we see today if we look at the ODA, Korean ODA to Asia? And these are very recent data. I don't go back very far in history. So this is the past decade. And we see that, well, first thing, Korean ODA has been rising quite consistently over time. And this is shown by the green curve. But we see that the share of Asia is quite substantial. So Korea is a very active aid provider, but this aid is primarily going to the closest partner of Korea, that is Asia. However, if we look at ASEAN, ASEAN is only one relatively small part of this Asia group. The countries that attract most of Korean ODA are actually Central Asian countries and not that much Southeast Asian countries. So you see that the share of ASEAN is about 20 to 30%, which is quite large. And the interesting point is that it's been extremely stable over time. So even though the share of the other Asian countries dropped, it's not the case for ASEAN. So ASEAN is apparently a very stable partner for Korea as far as ODA is concerned. So that's one first observation. The second is, if we split ASEAN into different groups, what do we see? Well, what we see is that most of the aid coming from Korea to ASEAN goes to the less advanced ASEAN countries, which should not come as a surprise. Of course, these countries are those that are most in need. So it's quite logical that they should attract most of the Korean aid. But we see that there is really a big gap between the amount of aid that is provided to the CLMV countries, namely Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, and the other ASEAN countries receiving aid, the ASEAN 4, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. So the gap is quite substantial. There is obviously a very strong focus on less advanced countries in ASEAN. Not totally surprising, but still the gap is more important than could be expected, I guess. So let's look at the ODA in more details even. And if we look at the ODA in more detail, what we see is that most of Korean ODA actually goes to Vietnam, which is shown in this light green, that's the light green part of the bar. So most of ODA is directed to Vietnam. A couple of changes over the recent years with the rise of Myanmar as a recipient of Korean aid. So another observation is that there is a very strong or sharp polarization of ODA on Vietnam. So Vietnam is definitely in a different category of its own compared to the others. So this is what we can observe as far as ODA is concerned. Now let's move to so outward direct investment flows by Korea to ASEAN. And here I also include India. By the way, when I was talking about ODA, I had included India here, but you can hardly see it. The reason being that the aid is very small. So it is in the graph, I can swear to you, but you cannot see it because it's so small that you can't see it. Okay, so now let's go back to ODI. So the evolution of ODI flows from Korea to ASEAN and India. We see that there has been a little bit of ODI around the middle of the 1990s. That was before the financial crisis. There was this boost in Korean ODI. The companies were thrilled and very excited about investing abroad. So this is why we had this rise at this point in time. But then came the crisis. And after the crisis, the Asian financial crisis, there was a long period of basically no ODI by Korean companies. They had been, well, they were surprised by the crisis, and they were also surprised by the fact that they had taken too many risks. So they stopped investing basically. And everything picked up again in the early 2000s. And we see that there is a sharp rise in ODI to ASEAN, a little bit of a rise to India, but it cannot be compared. So ASEAN is far ahead of India as a destination of Korean outward direct investment over time. And there is a real sharp pickup at the very end of this this period. The reason why there is a drop here is that the last data point that is shown on this graph is just the first 6 months of 2020. So that's why you have the drop. But at the end of the year, I don't think that the drop will be that that substantial. Okay. Well, now if we look at the at Korea ODA in percentage terms to ASEAN and to India, we see that the share of ODI flows to ASEAN is quite large, in particular over the past decade. So over the past decade, this share has been around, on average, around 25%. Some peaks around 30, but it's never really very, very low. So approximately on average, over the past decade, the share of ASEAN, of Korean ODI flows to ASEAN, is about 25%, which is really quite important. In comparison, India is really lagging behind again. So this is not a major partner for Korean companies. Korean companies are not investing that much in India, unlike what they do in ASEAN. Again, if we look at more details, what we see is that, well, ASEAN attracts a lot of Korean ODI, but it is in particular Vietnam that is attracting most of this outward direct investment. So here again, the substantial role of Vietnam is quite clear, in particular since the since 2014, to be more precise. So you see that the share of Vietnam is quite high. Quite high, and Another target for Korean ODI are the other CLM countries, which are shown in light blue here. So, and behind this CLM countries, it's in particular Myanmar that is attracting Korean ODI over the past few years. The other ASEAN 5 countries also attract some ODI, but it cannot be compared to what is being attracted by Vietnam. So here, as was the case for ODA, we have a strong focus on Vietnam, and Vietnam is really the major target of Korean ODI, as it was the major target of Korean ODA. And this is particularly true since 2015. So these are the observations from the Korean perspective. If we take the other perspective, if we take the ASEAN perspective, what do we see? Well, we see that Korea is actually not that big a player in terms of ODI. So here, this is ODI from Korea, from Japan, and from China in ASEAN countries, and as well as intra-ASEAN ODI. And we see that, well, Korea, which is shown here in green, is quite small compared to the two others. Well, Korea was ahead of China in 2010. But as early as 2011, Korea lags far behind China. And of course, it also lags far behind Japan. And it's been systematically the case until 2019. So from the perspective of Korea, ASEAN is a big partner. But from the perspective of ASEAN, well, Korea is not that big a partner. That concurs with what Professor Lee was saying before. Korea, after all, is a relatively small country. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that it is a small player compared to Japan and China. This is quite logical, but it makes a difference, and it's important to keep this in mind. It means that perhaps Korea has to find specific niches in order to make a difference, because on its own, given its size, it cannot make a difference. Okay, so these are all the observations that I can make based on this ODI and ODA data. And so if I sum up, what I can say is that ASEAN is an important partner for Korea, but Korea is a relatively marginal partner for ASEAN. Within ASEAN, Vietnam looms especially large, whatever the metrics you take, ODI or ODA. India is still a marginal economic partner for Korea. And finally, Korea, being a marginal player compared to the two other big East Asian players, has to find some specificities in order to make a difference and to play a real role. So this is what I observe, and this is what I conclude from these observations. Now, my personal assessment of the New Southern policy, given all these observations, my first point is to say, well, that in the economic sphere, this New Southern policy, I think, does not really consider that big a shift. And here again, I guess I concur with what has been explained by Professor Lee. In the economic sphere, Korea's privileged partners are not as clearly the big four: China, Japan, the US, and Russia. They are, of course, the obvious big partners in the diplomatic sphere or in the security sphere. But in the economic sphere, it's not really the case. Close neighbors, such as ASEAN countries, also loom quite large. So this is a major difference with the security sphere, and it means that in its economic dimension, the New Southern policy does not constitute, I think, so much of a shift. The second point that I wanted to make here is to say that, well, the New Southern policy, of course, does not develop in a vacuum. South Korea does not start from scratch in ASEAN or India. It can build on existing, well-developed economic relations with a number of Southeast Asian partners. So that bodes well for the further development of this New Southern policy. Third point is that to a large extent, the existing close relations between Korea and ASEAN are the result of private sectors initiatives. And this is shown through outward direct investment in particular. So as a result, the NSP strategy, which is a public strategy, and the private sectors or private companies' plans in Southeast Asia dovetail quite nicely. In other words, what we may say is that the economic facet of the New Southern policy squares well with entrenched private sector's interests or private economic interests. The next point is, in present context, and what I have in mind in the present context is rising wages in China, rising tensions between Korea and China, rising difficulties within China, hardening of the stance of the leaders, etc., etc. So given this context, the pressure to diversify away from China has never been as large, raising, of course, the attractiveness of alternatives, such as ASEAN and India. And on top of that, the COVID-19 pandemic has also exposed the risk of over-dependence on one single country to feed the global supply chains. As a result, companies are increasingly looking for alternative manufacturing bases, and as an alternative or as alternatives, India and ASEAN have a natural advantage. Of course, India also has a natural advantage in terms of market size. But if you take ASEAN as a whole, it is also a very big market comparable to India. So the two are possible alternatives. So the context is really very propitious to further development of economic relations with both ASEAN, between Korea and both ASEAN and India. For the time being, however, based on what we saw before, ASEAN is apparently in a slightly better position than India. And I would argue that India appears to be the weak link in the strategy so far. A last point, I think, based on all these reasons, I think that the New Southern policy may not suffer from what is very often observed in Korea, which is the fact that strategies are born and also die with each president. Each president stays in power for 5 years. Each president really pushes one strategy, pushes one slogan, pushes one pet project. And once the president is gone, the pet project is gone with him or her. And this is something quite standard in Korea. As far as the New Southern policy is concerned, I guess that the conditions are really in place for this policy to last beyond the president. Perhaps the name of the strategy will be changed, but the reality of the strategy will still be there. So my assessment is relatively positive on the sustainability of this new Southern policy, or at least of the substance of the new Southern policy, even if the name is changed. Final couple of comments, because time is running. As I said earlier, Korea being a small country, and Korea not being able to actually compete with Japan and China in terms of size, it has to find some areas where it can make a difference, where it can actually play a role without being in confrontation with the two other big players in East Asia. And I guess that infrastructure development may be a very promising sector. There are many reasons why I'm saying that. The first thing is that Korean construction companies usually have a relatively strong competitive advantage. So they are in a relatively good position to export their expertise abroad, and they've been doing that for a long time. So infrastructure development is probably a promising area. On top of that, well, of course, the two others are also quite heavily involved in infrastructure development. And this is in particular the case for China with the Belt and Road Initiative, and for Japan with the Quality Infrastructure Partnership. So there is competition in this area. But I think that still Korea is in a relatively good position to push in this sector. And on top of that, there is one specific subsector or niche in which Korea can play a role, and this is the example or the exports of smart cities. And if I understand properly, this is an area where Korea has been quite active, both in ASEAN and India. Here on this specific point, India is an interesting and important partner for Korean companies. So even though Korea may not be in the best position compared to the other big players, it can still make a difference in some niche activities. And I think that one of these niche activities in the big sector of infrastructure development is the smart city niche. It's just one example, but I think that it is the only possibility for Korea to actually play a real role in the region. It has to be different from the others. And so smart cities is one thing, industry 4.0 may be another possibility as well. So this is what I wanted to say. I guess I'm running out of time. And so I thank you for your attention. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Françoise, for this very rich presentation, which sets the continuity and perspectives for economic cooperation. I'll try to keep my discussion very brief to leave time for the audience to ask questions, and I encourage you to use the Q&A to raise questions. I think we need to see Korea's future cooperation with Asian countries and India in the context of the evolution of global value chains, which are becoming less based on labor cost differences, with some reshoring to advanced economies and more emphasis on flexibility and resilience, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. And in that way, regional global value chains may become even more important than before. As Professor Lee argued, Asian is a good source of labor for Korea. In addition, Korea is aging rapidly and hence may face increasing labor shortages. But moving beyond cheap labor is important for the sustainability of the Korea-Asian relationship, because automation diminishes the importance of low-skilled labor, because Asian countries will need to upgrade their production to raise standards of living, and because higher quality cooperation will create more mutual benefits, more balanced relationships, and hence more acceptance of free trade and investment. The digital economy, Françoise mentioned the smart cities, the fourth industrial revolution, ICT infrastructure, online services, e-commerce are areas for future cooperation where Korea has an advantage, I think. And advances in the trade and investment agreements will also need to incorporate this. Technology moves fast, Even national legislations are evolving, like through regulatory sandboxes in Korea, and this will need to be reflected in international agreements. Moving beyond industry could also deepen economic relations with more Asian countries with different needs and assets. India, with its software development and scientific capability, could provide more cooperation opportunities for Korea. And as Francois said, this the development of relations with Korea is still in its infancy, and it's important to develop it. I think another challenge is to boost Korean SMEs and startups. That's both a national and an external challenge. The Korean economic model is largely based on chaebols, big conglomerates. It needs to diversify. And there is also an international dimension to this. So is it possible to build region-wide ecosystems where SMEs prosper? With all countries, there is room for cooperation in building skills and knowledge, including through education, lifelong learning, vocational training, and R&D. Another question is about the cultural links. Are Korean and Asian countries culturally close? To some extent, yes, but enhancing cultural exchanges in an area like this is the government can play an important role that brings large benefits. Besides the so-called Korean wave, K-pop movies is both a source of revenue and also very positive for Korea's image in Asia and globally. And Professor Lee mentioned that there is a very young population in Asia, so it is important from that point of view. And the last point I would mention is healthcare, because there are a lot of needs for development in healthcare in the Asian region, also in India. And Korea has proved its excellence, particularly during the COVID crisis. There are possibilities for further cooperations. There are already investments, but there are possibilities for further investments and cooperation there. Now, maybe we can turn to the questions of the audience.
And if I may, Christophe,
yeah.
Actually, I would like to ask questions to Professor Lee.
Yeah.
Well, his presentation, and I guess, well, you're more a specialist on ASEAN than anything else, if I understand properly. But I have a question about India, because officially the new Southern policy is about Korea and its Southern partners, and the Southern partners being ASEAN, as I said. Within ASEAN, it's really Vietnam. So my first question would be this: do you think it is really possible to diversify within ASEAN beyond Vietnam? That's one first thing. And the second thing is India. India is officially part of this strategy, but I think it is much more complicated for the reasons that I highlighted. The relations between Korea and India are not as developed as between Korea and ASEAN today. So do you think it is possible to further, to deepen this relations with India, given the fact that India is still very much a closed economy, despite a number of allegations to the country by the current leadership? The reality is quite different, and it's well, there are huge barriers to entry in India. I guess India doesn't rank very well on the FDI restrictiveness index calculated by the OECD. So India is a difficult economy. So I would like to have your sense about the possible further development of these bilateral relations with India.
Okay, may I answer the question? Okay, I'm going to do what you asked first. In terms of India cases, when I boosted the new Southern policy, we emphasized ASEAN first. But if you're looking at the size of the India, we cannot, ignore the India. That's very important point. Is one more thing clear is that culturally, India is very far from Korea. I mean, not only the distance. I mean, Europe is more far away from the India than from Korea. However, in terms of cultural cases, India is too far away from Korea. I mean, if you're looking at why Korean was so close to Vietnamese, first of all, let me say that historical cases here. If you many Koreans visited Vietnam, they did not feel any difficulties. Maybe at first a little confused, but they soon adapted to Vietnam because historically we are very closely linked. For example, during the Ming Dynasty or Qing Dynasty, their paramount diplomacy was located in Beijing. The two countries are only Korea and Vietnam. So that there was many books is located there about how the Korean diplomats in the Vietnam, the Beijing can communicate with the Vietnamese diplomat by using Chinese characters. So many things that we are shared together at the same time. We have a kind of Vietnam experiences here. So many Korean soldiers right now, their ages of 70s and 80s, will spend about 6 or 7 years here during the Vietnam in 1960s and 70s. That also big negative impacted, but also is also very positive impacted, which means that Korean can recognize, understand the Vietnam too. At the same time, Vietnam is also on the same is true here. When the Korea and Vietnamese have a formal diplomatic relationship in 1992, as far as I guess in 1992, a lot of people are worried about the experience of Vietnam, maybe destroyed it, or maybe there were diplomats like that. However, it was a reverse effect with that. Maybe in terms of positive effect for that. And also we have a lot of cultural things about on the Confucianism, which is originated in China. But most of the scholars, in the Middle Ages in Europe, you have a university. In old days, before the Joseon Dynasty in Korea, it was before 19th century, we have colleges. The college name was Guojagan in Vietnam. The Korean name is Gukjagan, which is a similar system. Same king and same the administrative system. We share a lot of things together. It turns out to be that we know those facts, so that we realize that they are very common. A lot of things like maybe French people and maybe Spanish people share the Christianism like this. We are very surprised to know that. Yeah. And also that means that not only for the scholars like me, but also for the businessmen recognize the importance of the common shares here. That's why we have a little problem with the Malaysian people and Indonesian people here. They are Muslim people, so they are a little far away, a little away here. But Indian, so many Korean people went there India to have a big dream. They are very discouraged because there are so many things are different, such as this 1990s. But around year 2000 here, there are some stories about success, which is the Hyundai Motorcar company. They opened a motorcar factories over there, then it turns out to be a success. So that when the Hyundai Motorcar company opened the factories over there, many in the second and third, tier companies followed there. A kind of town is made it. That became a show of success. And right now, if you go to India, you can see many Hyundai Motorcar Korean-made cars. So that was one sign of the success, and that was surprising for all the Korean people living here. Then we say that maybe India may be far away in terms of cultural things, but there is a market. We have to focus on this. And the new southern policy when they made this economy, I said that it's a rebalance policy. Rebalance means that economic rate is the same, political rate should be approved. That because as for the economic societies, everything is done by the market. Businessmen do work very hard over there and they make a success. That is a story of the success in the South Asian country from the Korea. From the political side is always present to visit the US and China. Maybe they don't go to the Vietnam and like this. But for the first time, within 3 years, you present with the 10 countries and make many kind of exchange programs like this. It just have, I guess, is a beginning, and its outcome, maybe impact on the economic things, and maybe show them later. Because from now on, so far we focus on this like trade. Now we begin to focus on the service industry, which is like e-businesses, or as she said about smart city, something like that here. And what the Korean government did for the 3 years is the first thing when the president announced like new southern policy. Actually, the scholars and people don't know what does this mean. So what do you have to do? Actually, it's a black box. So that was the first thing was that committee under the presidential advisor was made. And second, what they are doing is that collected all the program just done on the South Asian country and India from the government. So each government, say like Ministry of Foreign Affairs do some businesses, Ministry of Internal Affairs do some businesses, Ministry of like Trade have some businesses. We are collecting all this information, make a big table, and we for the first time recognize that we do this kind of thing, we do that kind of thing, and categorize. Then we suddenly find that okay, this is what we are very too much. This is what we are too little, and we begin to classify them and overweight this detail. Then 3 days ago, we have some strategy announced by the president, which said that okay, we're going to focus on say like number 7 is about smart city. Number 1 is like healthcare system. Number 3 is I think education model. Number 5 is a Korean wave, such as things here. So first we say that when you say something like that, oh, this is the way to Korean promote the trade in the ASEAN. This is the way to promote FDI directive. That is not the case. We are focusing on the more long time. So that we're focusing on the data collection, we're focusing on this more new way of businesses rather than before here. So in terms of economic relationship, I think that on the total cases, maybe not changes, but in terms of quality cases, is a big shift. So that's what I'm saying, trying to say that here. And the Vietnam cases, I already say that. One more thing she asked is on the smart city cases. It's a very important, in terms of sizes, we cannot compete with Japan, we cannot compete with China, but we have to find a niche, as she said here. We find a niche thing, say something like smart cities one way, that e-commerce is one way, fintech is also announced it. When you say like a dam here, for example, a hydropower dam made this, we cannot build like Chinese big dams here. We like to have more energy efficient way. We have more using the ICT technology. Then we can build more smart things. We can build more efficient one. That's what Korea like to try to do. And also, we have to compete with the Japanese too here. For example, there has been some big projects, say like high-speed train from Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur to Singapore. That was announced 4 or 5 years ago here. A major country like Japan, China, and Korea compete. And from the beginning, we say that okay, this is not our play time. This is our playground. That is a playground for the Japan and China. They do it. What they are doing is that when they open the project, when they do actually businesses, maybe some of the Korean companies may participate in something, some places, some small shares. So that we have to cooperate with the Japanese company, we have to cooperate with the Chinese company, then you can take some shares, not the whole project. This is our position. You may say this very smart way. Okay, I think I gave the answers.
Okay, Francoise, do you have further questions or should we move to the questions from the audience? Okay, so, well, then some questions from the audience and one related to India, actually. What is the potential for cooperation between Korea and India in terms of nuclear energy?
So one of the important slogan, which is given by the today's president, is that they try to close down the nuclear energies. That was their slogan. Actually, they are trying to do it here. So that maybe some other developing country try to build the nuclear power plants, but in Korea we have many nuclear power plants, but we have to close down. So that it's kind of complicated. We have a very well advanced technology. We have many ways of cooperating with the foreign country. However, the current government do not recognize that benefit. So that was also an issue domestically in Korea too here. And also there are some kind of scandals going on, so that I don't think current regime can push on this project on building a nuclear power plant in other foreign countries. That is the current position of the government.
Okay. We have a number of questions regarding RCEP. The first one is what are the perspectives, how it improves the economic relationships? The second question is the reaction of the US. How do you think the US react to RCEP? It's sometimes described, even though it's initially led by Asian, it's sometimes described as a project pushed by China. So what is the possible reaction of the US? And the last question on RCEP is whether the Korean government was disappointed by the withdrawal of India, and is it a big deal? Given that there is already a free trade agreement with India, would RCEP bring much more to the relationship with India?
Okay, the three questions. First of all, in the RCEP, as I told you before, there's not been a lot of things in terms of economic benefit, economic traded before. Yeah, I told that because already among these 15 countries, except Korea, we have 14 countries. We already have a 13 countries free trade area, which is level is higher than this RCEP. However, in the bilateral cases like Korea and other countries, it's very difficult to push something to go forward from the previous, FTA agreement to the more forward. It's very difficult. However, in terms of this RCEP cases, many countries getting together, they have a direction, they are moving together. Then maybe one or two countries maybe have some objection. It is to go forward and forward. So in terms of a multilateral agreement cases, we think that is very positive to go forward, although it may be difficult in the future here. In terms of US cases, I don't know. I mean, for 1,000 years, Korea always has been surrounded by the big powers and try to survive. So that currently, the thing is that RCEP cases, they are focusing on the trade, because most of the country belongs to the RCEP. Member of the RCEP is a country with focus on manufacturing industry. Therefore, their focusing area is not traded. But CPP or TPCPP also is mentioned by the US and other countries. They are strong in the service industry, so they like to focus on this not only for the commodity trade, but also the service industry and maybe intellectual rights and everything like that. Then stories are different. And Korea is between this. We are not an advanced country like France and Germany and US. We are not a developing country like Malaysia and Thailand here. We are between this. So you have to find a position. So that if you're talking with this developing country, we have to adjust ourselves to the developing country cases. We are talking to the maybe TPP, CP more advanced country like US and other country. The rule will be set by them here. We have to adjust ourselves. The good thing for the Korean case is we are very quick. I mean, the best advantage we do have skill, the weapon for us to have is that we are able to move very quickly. So whenever the rule was setting by the big powers is, we have to adapt our services very quickly and try to get what we like to have. That is our position. So that we are not in the position to move a framework. That's what we have done for 1,000 years is actually here. So that's what I like so here. The Indian case is, India has been a close country for quite a long time. So that we know that here, but eventually, if India is close and close and close, that can be reduce the competitiveness of the Indian product and market in the future. So they have to looking at by themselves is what's the goal? I mean, the short run and long run. Maybe they can protect their industry for the short run, but the long run they may not. So let me make an interesting story here. I have been many projects in the Nepal. So that I go to some local, say like a motel here. When I visited there, I traveled with my backpack, and there was some electronic plugs over there, and two plugs. One is from made in India, one is from made in China. So that I asked the hotel manager, okay, you have two plugs, which one is good? Said that. But he said, of course, Chinese better. That's what he talking to me. What he told me is that why you ask such a simple question to me here? So Nepal people said, okay, we're philosophical and religious cases, we are close to India. But Chinese product, although it's a very 220 voltage plug, the Chinese one is much better, even though it's a very simple case. That's what I'm talking here. In the short run, maybe India can benefit for the people here, but in the long run, they lose a lot here, more than that here. That is a way to have politicians or educated people has to think about that. That's what I'm talking. I think I can give the answer to you.
Yeah, perhaps just one more thing about RCEP. Well, I agree with Professor Lee that RCEP actually doesn't make that much of a difference for Korea, which already had FTAs with most countries, except for Japan, of course. However, I would tend to argue that despite the existence of these various bilateral FTAs between Korea and all the other countries, I think RCEP does make a slight difference, which is the fact that now we have rules of very clear, apparently, rules of origin. And so, goods can circulate much more easily throughout the whole region. So I think this may be a slight difference, but I think that for some companies, it's not a slight difference. It is a big difference. So I think it will make the development of further development of regional production networks much easier. And so it does make a difference.
Yes, I agree with you.
Okay. Okay. Well, very good.
Yeah, actually, I also agree on the rules of origin. It is quite important. A last question. I think we are running out of time. There was a question about Korea has an aging population, and there are immigrants from Southeast Asia coming to Korea. And in that respect, what is the Korean government doing to help promoting the Korean language in Southeast Asia?
Language say this that okay. I don't know. I'm not specialized in promoting cultures, but I'm familiar with so many Asian, South Asian people that can speak Koreans, although they cannot know the meaning, because they learned some Korean music song. They can sing together, but they don't know the music here. But they don't know the meaning of that song. And also there are many schools here provides a kind of language lessons here, because some of the Korean company over there, they give a privilege to the people who can speak Korean. I heard that in some Vietnam universities say that anybody who specializes in Korean language majors will have a job before finishing the university. Maybe they finish the 3 years of education, even though the full area is 4 years. They just finish 3 years of education. They are just have a jobs, because many Korean companies try to recruit them here. Thing is that Koreans, today's Korean young people can speak English and speak maybe French and like this, but old generation has never been speak foreign languages before. So that many Korean companies located in South Asian countries are the labor-intensive industry, which has been managed by the old people, like 60 and 70 years old. They have been businesses in the 1970s and 80s here. So that these people moved there and they have originated, therefore they prefer to use the language. So that they provide some fund to the university, they provide some fund to private schools, and they learn, so that the local people learn the Korean language, get the job, and that's the way it is today here. Sometimes I was very surprised on the maybe some tweet on the signs that say that you can learn Korean here within 2 months or something like that. So in Vietnam, or even I found some advertisement in Nepal, for example, here. So that currently, I don't know I'm not a specialist on this, but we like to promote the Korean government try to promote those things, not for the local language promotion, but I think that to help the Korean company. That's the way it is. But although besides the language, we have a lot of things to share about Korean culture. That's a different issue. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much to you, Professor Lee, and to Francoise for this fascinating session. I think we have to end it there and go for the break. So thank you to everyone, the speakers and all those who attended.
Thank you. Thank you.
So welcome back, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be moderating that second session on more diplomatic and security aspects related to the new Southern policy of South Korea. The first session was indeed dealing with the economic aspects, and it was a very, very interesting and stimulating panel. And now we're going to move to the second one. Just a very, very brief reminder to kind of give some background to these diplomatic and security parts. Let's remind all of you that President Moon was actually the first presidential candidate ever to mention the ASEAN in its election promises back in the election in 2017. Unlike other presidents, President Moon had clearly a goal towards the ASEAN country and India in the very early stage of his administration. And that's why the new Southern policy has been announced so early in his mandate. He made the promise and fulfilled it to go visit all of the 10 members of the ASEAN, the 10 countries of the ASEAN. This is a highly symbolic and a very high diplomatic gesture. Reminds me actually of Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton, visiting the 10 countries of the ASEAN during the first mandate of Barack Obama administration. And it was also back then a clear sign sent in a very positive gesture sent to the Southeast Asian countries. Second, and as Francois Nicola reminded us, what was very important is the institutionalization of that new Southern policy that led actually to a presidential committee in charge of implementing the new Southern policy as early as 2018. But I've talking too much already. I'm going to introduce our two excellent and distinguished panelists. The first one, Dr. and Professor Choi Won-gi, is the head of the Center for ASEAN and India Studies at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. The KNDA is the new name of what was Institute of Foreign Service Officers that was created in 1963. And of course, that institute has grown into the KNDA to become the key institute dedicated to training diplomats and of course conducting research on Korea's foreign policy. And it's indeed a very prime think tank and institute in Korea. Our second panelist will be Dr. John Nielsen Wright, the Korea Foundation Korea Fellow and Senior Fellow for Northeast Asia at the renowned Chatham House, and also a senior lecturer at the University of Cambridge. Three and few questions before the two presentations to kind of give some angle to what will be your presentation. In the agenda, we had some questions related, of course, to the common interest between Korea, the ASEAN, and India. Second, the prospect for security cooperation, be it traditional or non-traditional security. The question of how the Republic of Korea can fit into several Indo-Pacific initiatives. And at that point, I will ask our two panelists to give also, maybe at the end of the presentation, if it's not in their presentation, the areas of cooperation with third parties, and of course, including the European Union and the European Union member states, sorry, because as you all know, France has laid out its own Indo-Pacific strategy more than 2 years ago. Germany has done so a few weeks ago, early September, and the Netherlands has released its own Indo-Pacific strategy yesterday. So it's actually a good opportunity today to also discuss the potential of cooperation between Korea and Europe in the Indo-Pacific, and especially in Southeast Asia and India. But I've once again talked way too much, and I give the floor to Professor Choi Won-gi first. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Greetings from Seoul. I'd like to address the three key questions that you laid out. Before my presentation, so this is my personal views, does not represent the official standpoint. So I'm presenting in my individual capacity as a researcher. So I'd like to first talk about the background of the New Southern Policy, NSP, and then I'd like to point out 4 core policy elements: the economic diversification, second, the diplomatic rebalancing, and third, enlisting support for Korea's DPRK policy. And 4, NSP is also a Korea's new regional cooperation policy. So I'd like to address these 4 policy elements briefly. And then I'd like to touch upon Korea's position on US-China rivalry and Korea's response regarding America's Indo-Pacific strategy. And finally, I'll touch upon the strategic aspect of New Southern policy. As many of you already are well aware of, New Southern policy, NSP, is the most successful policy initiative that President Moon has launched since his inauguration. So NSP was officially announced in November 2017. And he has many other domestic as well as foreign policy initiatives. Out of his many policy initiatives, NSP has delivered the most. So it is regarded as most successful policy initiative by Moon administration. So I think the key concept behind New Southern policy is diversification, economic as well as diplomatic diversification. If you look at the Korea's external economic as well as diplomatic profile, you have some sort of kind of bias. For example, in terms of trade relations, I mean, China takes more than 26% of overall Korea's trade. So you want to kind of diversify away from a few concentrated economic partners. So in that regard, economic diversification is kind of a #1 core policy element. And also, if you look at the conventional Korean diplomatic orientation, you have some sort of a bias embedded in Korean diplomatic approach regarding prioritizing the so-called Big Four, the United States, China, Japan, and Russia. Because I mean, these 4 major countries has the greater influence over Korean Peninsula. Naturally, Korea has traditionally devoted its diplomatic resources on these countries. But as the 10th largest economy in the world, and as a so-called middle power in the world, I mean, the national interest of South Korea go way beyond Korean Peninsula. So we have many national interest go, and in that regard, in Korean external diplomatic and economic approaches, Southeast Asia and India have been most underappreciated, right? So in terms of economic interactions and diplomatic relations, you have some sort of gap between the Korea's policy orientation and the reality of the importance of these partners to Korea. So in that regard, the New Southern policy, NSP, is a kind of effort to diversify away from the existing kind of concentrated partners in economic and diplomatic areas. So the #1 core policy element of New Southern policy is economic diversification. So Southeast Asia, India, so these are one of the most fast-growing economies in the world. So you want to naturally strengthen your links with these fast-growing economies so that you could reap the economic benefits. And also, if you look back on the China's economic retaliation in mid-2016, after Korea decided to deploy the THAAD missile battery, right? So we had a very severe informal economic retaliation. So this indicates the vulnerability based on our kind of overly skewed trade relations with China. So you want to diversify away from this. Yeah. So this is the economic diversification and also diplomatic kind of diversification, or what I call diplomatic rebalancing, right? So as I pointed out, in the conventional Korea's diplomatic orientation, ASEAN and India have been always kind of regarded as a secondary partner. But now the aspiration embedded in NSP is that you want to elevate diplomatic ties with Southeast Asia and India to the level of big four major countries. So in that regard, we kind of, for the last 3 years, there have been some sort of institutional reinforcement in the Korean foreign ministry regarding Southeast Asia. For example, we established a ASEAN bureau in Mofa, Korea, which is a dedicated independent bureau only kind of working on ASEAN matters. So this is the kind of quite new development. And also we upgraded the ASEAN mission in Jakarta. So we tripled the number of steps, and also the ambassador representing Korea's ASEAN mission is now the former vice minister. So in this way, there has been some sort of institutional reinforcement in Korean MOPA regarding ASEAN. And also the third element is with this new certain policy, we want to elicit support for our approach toward DPRK. If you look at the relationship between DPRK and ASEAN, all 10 ASEAN member countries have a diplomatic relationship with DPRK. And whether they do bad things or good things, for example, when they do the drug trafficking, North Koreans usually do those bad things in ASEAN, Southeast Asia. For example, several years ago, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un had his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, assassinated in Malaysia, right? So in that sense, the relationship between Southeast Asia and DPRK is very good. So with this, with this expanded channel of cooperation with ASEAN member countries, we expect ASEAN member countries play greater role of mediating DPRK with international community. So if you look at the first and second DPRK, US DPRK summit, which was happened in Singapore and Vietnam, right? I mean, the reason why they had the summit meetings in Singapore and Vietnam, because they have a good relationship with DPRK. So with this, we expect ASEAN to play more proactive and constructive role in engaging DPRK. The fourth policy element of the certain policy, I think this is President Moon's new regional cooperation strategy. I think NSP signifies Seoul's hedging effort in regional environment of increasing US-China strategic competition. So regarding the regional cooperation, the concept of inclusiveness is central in Korea's regional cooperation strategy, because we want a regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific to be inclusive of every nation, not excluding any particular country. So in that regard, I think we have some overlap with the ASEAN concept of regional initiative, the AOIP. So we officially, President Moon is officially endorsing AOIP and try to maximize the synergies between NSP and AOIP. So in this regard, especially with regard to the intensification of U.S.-China rivalry, I think Korea regard some sort of kind of inclusive regional groupings or regional cooperative mechanism is important. So in that regard, we have the same interest with ASEAN and India as well. So in particular, Korea is in active support of ASEAN-led multilateral mechanisms to be the base of the emerging regional architecture, for example, like the EAS. Right, now let me move on to Korea's position on US-China rivalry. If you look at the public speeches of President Moon has made it clear that he does not want to take a side with the US as opposed to China, even if we are a security ally of the United States. So this is what this sort of President Moon's stance is what is called balanced diplomacy. This is balanced diplomacy, not balancing diplomacy. Whatever you do, you want to have a balance between the United States and China. This means that you don't want to take a side. So basically, the balanced diplomacy means that taking no side or taking a position of strategic ambiguity between Washington and Beijing. So you want to maintain, you want to keep the solid security alliance with the United States. At the same time, you want to keep strategic partnership with China because China is important economically. Also, China is important in dealing with Dprk issue. So we want to maximize the constructive and cooperative relationship, both with United States and China. But the problem is, as US-China rivalry intensifies, this stance of neutrality, or you could call it a fence straddling, right? I mean, it is getting more and more difficult to keep this sort of stance, right? You have conflicting demands from China on the one hand and United States on the other hand. So yeah, it's a posing increasingly difficult dilemma. So this explains why Seoul has not been so enthusiastic about U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Seoul's Korea's reaction to U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy has not been very clear and forthcoming, if not negative. Seoul does not feel entirely comfortable with the strategic nature of this Indo-Pacific strategy that squarely focuses on countering China. So as a security ally of the United States, on a bilateral basis, I think Korea is more than willing to cooperate with US Indo-Pacific strategy, where in areas where we feel comfortable. But also, I think Korea has been making very serious efforts not to provoke China in any way we can. So in that respect, I think Korea's stance regarding U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy has been deliberately ambiguous. We try to cooperate. We want to cooperate with the United States with the Indo-Pacific initiative, right? But we don't, for example, we don't want to participate in the FANUP operations, for example, because that causes us problem with China. Right. Then let me move on to the last part of my presentation, the strategic aspect of New Southern policy. Well, this is my personal perspective. I think by design, New Southern policy does not have any serious strategic and security elements. President Moon did not present NSP to ASEAN countries as a security policy. If you look at the policy projects under the peace pillar, which is one of the three main pillars of New Southern policy, people, prosperity, and peace, you can't really find the hardcore security policy projects. Under the peace pillar, we have the non-traditional security cooperation. We have defense industry cooperation, but we don't have such kind of security cooperation, like, for example, maritime security or kind of the harder security issues. So I think Korea wants to present the certain policy as a functional cooperation initiative to ASEAN and India and other partners, other countries in the region. So I think Seoul wants to sell NSP as non-strategic, non-political security agenda, even if that kind of approach itself implies strategic implications. The reason is, I think Korea wants to play the role of and depict itself as a benign, non-strategic actor with no ambition or strategic intention, such as BRI or FOIP. So the official line is that as a responsible middle power in the region, we want to play a regional roles that Korea should play. But we do not have some sort of strategic ambition or desire like some other big players. So in that regard, I think by design, you do not really, it is really difficult to find the strategic or security elements. But this is where you have the dilemma of NSP. Because Korea aims to expand its diplomatic horizon and desires to play its regional role as a responsible middle power, which requires Korea to play greater roles in strategic and security areas. For example, as a maritime trading nation, Korea has critical stakes in the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. But because you do not want to provoke China, you keep a position of neutral and benign bystander on the issue of South China. So keeping silence on the assertive behavior of China. So on the one hand, you have some kind of strong request and pressure from the United States regarding the basic tenets and the elements of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. But you also want to kind of maintain good relationship with China. So I think Korea is increasingly being torn apart and pulled apart between these two contradictory kind of pressure. So I'm not sure how in the coming future, how long Korea can maintain this kind of the balanced diplomacy stance. So in conclusion, on the one hand, Korea finds like-minded partners in Southeast Asia, in that a number of ASEAN countries want to avoid taking a side between US and China. So this applies to Korea as well. So ASEAN countries want to keep a strategic distance from both of them. And in this regard, Korea is in the same situation. But on the other hand, it is increasingly difficult and it is a daunting challenge for Korea to maintain a stance of strategic ambiguity or neutrality. Because you have contradictory kind of conflicting pressure from both China and United States. So I think in this respect, as long as Korea wants to pursue NSP as being devoid of any strategic elements, I think it is not clear whether the NSP could provide a way out of this kind of a strategic dilemma for Korea in the coming future. I'll stop here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that very comprehensive presentation on the very multi-dimensional aspect of the Korean New Southern Policy, but also, as you say perfectly, the conflicting pressure, I would say, from both China and US on that matters. So I will open the floor straight to John, and then I will maybe raise 2 questions, and then, of course, get to the Q&A, so we have plenty of time to answer all of the questions I'm receiving in the Q&A box.
Great. Thank you very much, Antoine. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to see old friends. I'm normally resident in Paris, but I'm actually speaking to you today from Cambridge because Cambridge University is still teaching a little bit in person despite the impact of COVID-19. But it's particularly welcome to have this French connection back again. In the brief amount of time I have, I thought I'd talk about the three elements. First, beginning by looking at the structural constraints that I think Professor Che has outlined very persuasively, and then look at the specific reasons why South Korea might feel that there are geostrategic as well as broader political and economic forces compelling it to develop a closer relationship both with ASEAN and India, and then finish by asking that addressing the broader question of the Indo-Pacific and where South Korea fits into America's emerging strategy. I should preface my remarks by saying I'm not a Southeast Asia specialist. There are people here who are much more well-informed, so this is very much an outside perspective. Starting with the structural questions, yes, I think it's clear that under the Trump administration, a more adversarial posture towards China has created greater tensions for Seoul as it finds itself increasingly drawn into a relationship with its traditional ally that compels it to adopt de facto a more potentially provocative position towards the PRC. And as was mentioned, the impact of that critical THAAD deployment in the first year of the Moon administration demonstrated why that is so problematic for Seoul, given the willingness of the Chinese government to use real economic pressure that has an impact on South Korea's interests. And we see that, of course, in the experience of companies like Lotte, the decline in tourism on the part of Chinese tourists to South Korea, the significant impact that it may have on educational opportunities for young Koreans. And of course, China is important not only because it's this enormous economic market, but also because it clearly delivers real strategic opportunities for South Korea in Northeast Asia. And obviously in terms of its relationship with the Dprk, the close alliance relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang means that for very good strategic reasons, the partnership with China remains very important. With the advent of a Biden administration next year, it may be that some of those challenges that need to balance its alliance relationship with the United States and the need to accommodate and not alienate China may be moderated a little, but perhaps that's something we can come back to in the Q&A session. I think it's fair to say that this growing rivalry between Washington and Beijing is going to be the dominant structural constraint that limits opportunities for South Korea and provides, I think, continuing pressure and continuing incentives to develop this more nuanced and, I think, as Professor Che rightly describes, diversified approach to regional foreign policy. But beyond the structural arguments, I think it's partly a function of identity, South Korea's identity and its increasing desire, shaped not only by elite opinion, but also by public opinion in South Korea, for South Korea to demonstrate its ability to act as an autonomous or at least semi-autonomous actor. And this has been part of what I would describe as a type of policy entrepreneurship that we've seen not just in the current Moon administration, but going back across many different presidential administrations, even back in the early 1990s when No Tayu launched his Nordpolitik, and of course, importantly, normalized relations with the PRC. We've seen many examples of this effort by South Korean leaders to develop a more flexible approach and a more distinctive and nationally branded approach to foreign policy making. After 1996, of course, when South Korea joined the OECD, we saw under the leadership of Kim Young-sang a talk of globalization and this desire to position South Korea as a power that has a global reach and a distinctive reach underpinned by its own strategic innovations. When it comes to both North and Southeast Asia, we've seen that on the part of past presidents. We saw it, of course, under Lee Myung-bak and his new Asia initiative. We saw it very dramatically under Park Geun-hye in her response to the launch of the Belt and Road in 2013 with a talk of a Eurasia initiative. It's perhaps part of the political dynamics in South Korea that presidents need to be clearly identified with meaningful and innovative policy measures. And that's, of course, partly driven by a desire to enhance economic opportunities. It's not purely a political and strategic factor. As I think was said in the first session, despite being a continental power, South Korea has to face the fact that North Korea acts as an obstacle to developing a more integrated and connected economic relationship with Eurasia more broadly, hence President Park's push to develop her Eurasia initiative. And part of this strategy of developing new policy initiatives is partly because South Korean elites have thought of South Korea as a country that can bridge between the divisions between larger and smaller powers, which of course explains why reaching out to Southeast Asia has been so attractive and underpins, I would argue, the launch of the new Southern policy in 2017. As important as acting as a bridging player is the idea of South Korea as a country that embraces multilateralism and regionalism. And we see that reflected in both the decision to join AIIB and, of course, RCEP. RCEP, of course, in its early years, seen as a wider regional body that would include both China and India. And of course, if it needs repeating, again, it's not just in Northeast Asia that we see past initiatives by previous presidents, such as the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative under President Park, but also relatively fluid multilateral organizations such as MICTA, which was launched along with NAPSI in 2013. Stepping back from those structural factors, why ASEAN and India? Why these two potential new partnerships? Well, partly, of course, because they represent middle powers. And when I use the word middle powers, I'm not thinking narrowly in terms of simple power metrics, in terms of size or of geography. It's as much as I think one of the innovators who first launched the idea of middle power diplomacy, Soya Yoshihide, a Japanese commentator, observed, it's as much about identity. It's as much about middle powers that see themselves as uniquely placed to avoid some of the tensions that either operated during the Cold War or subsequently. Seeing policy as neither binary nor aligned with either rising powers or existing powerful powers. Now, during the Cold War, much of this middle power identity tended to be defined in very niche specific terms. What's different now, I think, is that there is a real ambition on the part of a range of middle power actors, not just South Korea and ASEAN, but also, of course, countries like Japan and others, to be involved in the process of architecture building. So middle power capacity is now defined in terms of the ability to define the strategic framework for international relations in the region and more widely afield. And that brings me to ASEAN, because ASEAN has shown itself in a way to be adopting some of that entrepreneurial policy innovation that we associate with South Korea. We see it in 2015 with the launch of the ASEAN Economic Community, and of course a political and security community and a social and cultural community. We see it, of course, in the distinctive quality of the ASEAN way with its focus on consensus and respect for national sovereignty. And in a way, South Korea has, I think, quite sensibly seized upon these, this greater appetite on the part of ASEAN to find an alternative to its traditional preoccupation with big power relations. It's very striking that President Moon has been very explicit in saying that its outreach to ASEAN is an attempt to find an alternative to its traditional preoccupation with the big four powers. As has also been mentioned in the last session, reaching out to ASEAN is a way of minimizing dependence on the Chinese market in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. That makes sense in terms of reducing the vulnerability of supply chains. But it's also been reinforced, of course, by ASEAN's willingness to be explicit about its response to the Indo-Pacific initiative, first launched by Japan back in 2007, and now, of course, reinforced as part of America's national security strategy. And it was ASEAN's statement in 2019, its launch of its Indo-Pacific outlook, that I think we can see the relative attractiveness of South Korea positioning itself closer to the ASEAN view of the Indo-Pacific in a way that differentiates it from the more combative approach from the United States. ASEAN, of course, in 2019, making it clear that it would not be dependent on outside powers in framing its own discourse about what a free and open Indo-Pacific should actually look like. And President Moon, I think, has been quick to underscore his commitment to ASEAN, as Antoine, I think, rightly pointed out, the only South Korean president to visit all 10 ASEAN member countries. When we think back to 2019 and the 30th anniversary of the establishment of an ASEAN-ROK dialogue partnership, that major conference in Busan with over 10,000 people attending was a very tangible demonstration of the commitment on the part of South Korea to the importance of that relationship. And the establishment of 2018, excuse me, of a presidential committee on the new Southern policy, with its focus, as Professor Che was pointing out, on people, prosperity, and peace, is a demonstration that rhetorically, South Korea is seeking many opportunities to underscore its commitment to these values. But I would say that where ASEAN is concerned, and again to echo what Professor Che was saying, the focus is primarily economic and cultural. It was striking that in that 2019 Busan summit, there was very little mention in the joint communique of the issue of strategic cooperation. Does that mean that the opportunities for thinking strategically with ASEAN are limited? Well, perhaps not. I mean, of course, there are ASEAN framework structures such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, where North Korean diplomats have participated in the past. Some people have suggested that the ASEAN Foreign Ministry retreat should include regularly the foreign ministers of the two Koreas. And one area which I think is very important, going back to that 2019 ASEAN statement on the Indo-Pacific outlook, is the emphasis on sustainable development. North Korea has sought since 2017 to underscore its commitment to sustainable development goals. Now, that may be boilerplate rhetoric on the part of the North, but there may be opportunities for closer cooperation in these areas, something that we could perhaps come back to in the Q&A session to discuss. So there are areas in which there can be cooperation in addressing North Korea. But when it comes to the broader question of China's challenge to regional security, it's right to say South Korea has been very nervous about the idea of being dragged into any territorial conflict. South Korea has no territorial states in the South China Sea. It has been reluctant to participate in freedom of navigation operations. But one area where there are, of course, economic opportunities that have a security dimension is the sale of arms. Indonesia, for example, is the biggest buyer of defense equipment from South Korea. South Korea provides both submarines, frigates, FA-50 aircraft can also be provided to states within the region as part of economic deals that benefit both parties. And South Korea, of course, has donated some defense equipment, particularly to the Philippines, a Pohang-class frigate, for example, which demonstrates that there are small but tangible opportunities to be gained in this area. Part of, I think, one of the questions we need to ask as well is how receptive are Southeast Asians to this new initiative from South Korea? Recent polling conducted by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore reveals, interestingly, that on the part of ordinary Southeast Asians, South Korea is not seen as a natural partner. Just 0.9% of people polled suggested that they were confident that South Korea would be willing and able to uphold international order and the rule of law. In sharp contrast, for example, to Europe, seen by 33% of respondents as playing an important role in promoting those very important values, or Japan, 25%, or even Australia, 5.7%, according to the polls. So there's a long way for South Korea to go in developing real confidence on the part of Southeast Asian public opinion. Let me say a few words about India. India is not an obvious partner for South Korea in terms of developing a more active bilateral security partnership. After all, India closely associated during the Cold War with the non-aligned movement, and South Korea, by contrast, clearly dependent on its traditional alliance relationship with the United States. But we've seen a number of important initiatives that underscore, at least in the economic sphere, the opportunities for the two countries to work closer together. The announcement of a comprehensive economic partnership in 2009, development of a strategic partnership in 2010, upgraded in 2015 to a special strategic partnership. And bilateral trade between India and South Korea is somewhere in the region of $20 billion. Relatively small by comparison with all of South Korea's economic activity, and heavily weighted in favor of South Korea, less so in the case of India. But there have been some important symbolic and rhetorical efforts by the Moon administration to underscore the importance of the relationship between New Delhi and Seoul. It was President Moon who sent a special envoy in 2017 to New Delhi, shortly after taking over as president. And in 2018, of course, President Moon visited India. IFANS itself, the Diplomatic Academy, established in 2018 its own Center for ASEAN Indian Studies, in a sense laying the groundwork for this discussion we're having today. And the Korea Foundation has been very focused in strengthening human-to-human relations between students in India and South Korea. I mentioned weapon sales in the case of ASEAN and Korea. There are moves afoot to sell anti-aircraft technology to India at a price tag of about $2.6 billion. It raises interesting questions of how other states will respond to these sorts of initiatives, Russia or China for that matter. And there are some areas where the absence of cooperation between India and South Korea is striking, at least in terms of formal statements. We know, for example, that Pakistan was a significant party in enhancing North Korea's own nuclear proliferation and nuclear capacity. And yet the Moon administration, perhaps for good diplomatic reasons, has been relatively muted in calling out Pakistan under, in a sense, limiting opportunities for closer cooperation with Delhi in highlighting Pakistan's disruptive role in this area. One area, of course, where middle powers such as Japan, Australia, and other players have been heavily involved in security cooperation is through joint exercises. And here again, there's not much evidence of any South Korean activity in this area. In 2019, however, a new logistics agreement between the Indian Navy and the South Korean Navy was signed, which will facilitate port visits by Indian ships to South Korea. But this is small beer activity. It's not particularly significant. At the level of public diplomacy, Prime Minister Modi, of course, visited Seoul in 2019 to receive the Seoul Peace Prize. And during his visit, he said, I think, again, underscoring the rhetorical commitment between the two countries, is that the South Korean model of economic development is the best model for India going forward. One area that was signaled as part of that bilateral visit is counterterrorism. And it may be that there are areas of cooperation between the two countries here that can be developed. But broadly speaking, much of the scope of the bilateral relationship between India and South Korea, again, I would stress, is economics. Issuing of visas, for example, to increase tourism between India and South Korea, civil nuclear energy cooperation, India's digital initiative, which may provide opportunities for the two countries to cooperate. All of these, I think, provide important opportunities. And I'm just plugging in my computer because I see I'm running low on battery. But a lot of this talk is aspirational. The South Korean ambassador to India, Chum Hui-hye, in July of last year said, we need to work together to strengthen the regional architecture. Well, that's a very positive aspiration, but I wonder at what point this becomes a meaningful, tangible demonstrable set of outcomes. Finally, let me say a few words about the United States and the Indo-Pacific. We know that Washington has been repeatedly asking South Korea to do more. And we know that President Moon initially in 2017 was very hesitant about responding to the Indo-Pacific Initiative. That, I think, has changed. In 2019, President Moon explicitly backed the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. We know, for example, that in 2019, South Korean naval forces did join with the US-led Pacific Vanguard exercises, including ships from both Japan and Australia. But we also know that the other big regional security initiative, the Quad, is something that, for good reasons, the South Korean government, as recently underscored by Chung In-moon, President Moon's foreign policy advisor, was not seen as an area where South Korea should be involved, precisely because of its fear that this would antagonize China. And of course, when the Quad is mentioned, the presence of Japan, a country with which South Korea has, of course, extremely difficult diplomatic ties at the moment because of the legacy of history and identity politics, complicates any further cooperation. Mike Green, the former Asia director of the National Security Council under President Bush, has said publicly that he thinks that there is a real gap between South Korea's ambitions in terms of its playing a role in Southeast Asia in regional security architecture and its ability to deliver. That observation, I think, is well meant, but I would finish, if I may, by citing some recent developments, because as some of you may know, just a few days ago in Seoul, there was an important meeting between Mark Napper, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan, and his counterpart, Ko Yoon-ju, the Director General of the North America Affairs Division of the Foreign Ministry. And I just want to quote to you some of the conclusions of that meeting, because I think it's quite striking. This year, in August, both countries, both the United States and South Korea, launched their new Indo-Pacific Strategy New Southern Policy Dialogue process. And this meeting that took place just a few days ago has signaled the desire on the part of both countries to cooperate in trying to harmonize these two initiatives. As the readout from that meeting says, both countries are working together to create a safe, prosperous, and dynamic Indo-Pacific, recognizing through cooperation between the two countries the importance of openness, inclusiveness, transparency, and respect for international norms and ASEAN creativity. Now, it's striking, the areas that are signaled in that joint readout as the basis for cooperation are, broadly speaking, non-traditional security areas. Infrastructure, energy, digital economy, smart cities, national resources management, building a people-centered community, human resource development, anti-corruption, championing good governance by investing in human resources, anti-corruption, and investing in human capital by promoting women's empowerment and spearheading health and climate change. That resonates very much, I think, with the new Southern Policy Plus that the Moon administration has embraced for its cooperation with ASEAN. And it's in that area where we see these very traditional elements: healthcare, education, infrastructure, and pandemic preparation, not hardcore security issues. The last concluding point to think about, and for us to discuss perhaps, is what happens after President Moon. Will there, as Francois, I think, has pointed out, in terms of the economic relationship, be continuity? Or when it comes to politics and security, will a new president deviate from this approach? How will public opinion in South Korea view this level of increased engagement? What pressure will the Biden administration place on South Korea? The readout from that phone call between President-elect Biden and President Moon stressed the importance of democracy promotion. And this is one area, of course, where there may be tensions for South Korea in maintaining this policy of strategic ambiguity that Professor Che referred to. And last but not least, the unexpected, events dear boy, events, as former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan used to say. A crisis over Taiwan, the question of human rights in Hong Kong, and of course the wider risk of an actual shooting war between the Americans and the Chinese. How will South Korea manage those sorts of challenges? It doesn't minimize the importance of thinking about those questions, but for now at least, I think it's much more the economic and cultural space that defines South Korea's relationship both with India and with ASEAN. But with that, I'll end my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I will start with maybe 3 sets of comments and question included that will also gather some of the questions that I received, and then of course open the full Q&A. My first one would be, how do you compare the new Southern policy with other initiatives that are being undertaken by other countries in the region, including Taiwan, and the so-called new southbound policy? I see that one of the key differences is that from the Taipei point of view, they include also New Zealand and Australia, unlike Seoul. And it leads me to one question: how do you put Australia and New Zealand into the new Southern policy? How do you put Korea into the relation with the South Pacific island countries? Korea is a dialogue partner of the Pacific Island Forum, just like many other countries, China, Canada, Turkey, etc. But would you say there is a specific Korean policy towards both Australia and the Pacific Islands? My second comments and set of questions is related to what you both mentioned. Professor, you mentioned the defense industry cooperation. John, you mentioned, of course, the arms sales. De facto, Korea is a big arm provider to Southeast Asia. From 2014 to 2018, according to Ifri, it was a third provider behind Russia and the US, but before China. And Southeast Asia has represented, since the end of the 1990s, a third of South Korean arms exports. So it's a key partner. How do you see the evolution of this kind of security de facto cooperation in terms of defense industry? John mentioned, of course, the huge partnership with Indonesia, including, of course, the developments of the KFX, the Advanced Light Combat Aircraft, between Korea and Indonesia. And I would add some question I received also. One question from Sophie Boisseau-Durocher that was actually on the different kind of security cooperation that could be added, including common exercises, but John already kind of mentioned it, but also the defense education. Are there a special partnership between Kukpongdae, the Korean National Defense University, and some Southeast Asian equivalent, etc.? And another question linked also to the same set of questions and remarks on defense cooperation. A question from someone else on the Quad Plus format. And Seoul participated this spring with this kind of Quad Plus format with Vietnam, New Zealand, etc. What could be the position of Korea, not on the Quad per se, but on this kind of enlarged framework? Could be also including, of course, France and the UK and some opportunities, etc. And my last and final comment and question is about actually a key region in Southeast Asia, that the Mekong. Korea has been holding since 2011 the Mekong Korea Foreign Ministers meeting. There had been a huge 2019 summit on the Mekong. Korea has been focusing a lot on Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. It was also mentioned on the ODA, of course, aspect in the first panel. So how would you characterize, I would say, that specific focus on Korea, on the Mekong region, at the time when other regional partners, be it China, be it the US, be it Australia, all have also a special focus on Mekong? And would you say there is something specific in the Korean approach to it? So thank you. I will let you answer maybe these 3 sets of questions first, maybe with Professor Choi Won-gi first, then John, and then of course the other questions will come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, very important questions. Well, the first question regarding Korea's stance on the southern countries like New Zealand, Australia, and South Pacific. Of course, we have a bilateral ministerial meeting with PIF countries. And also, as a like-minded country, we have a very close cooperation going on between Australia and New Zealand as well. And I think, a lot of people ask what would be the geographical boundary of New Southern policy. Is it really confined to 10 ASEAN member countries and India only? Well, I would say that there is no fine line of NSP partners. I mean, we all know that Korea is a middle income, middle power, right? We have limited resources and capability. So with this new initiative, we first start with Southeast Asia and India and try to expand from there. For example, about 2 years ago, at the end of 2018, Korea joined IORA, Indian Rim Association group, as a 10th dialogue partner. So in this way, we try to first focus on Southeast Asia and India and try to expand. So regarding, in that sense, I think the southern countries, New Zealand, Australia, and South Pacific are also important partners in this regard. Korea's initiative toward diversifying effort toward the southern part of the globe. Second question about the Korean arms sales. Yeah, the Southeast Asia is really a big market for Korea's arms sales. You pointed out that there are kind of huge, big projects going on between Korea and Indonesia. And well, these are the defense industry cooperation are kind of handled from the perspective of economic transaction, right? So we have defense industries due to North Korean aggression, right? So we would like to expand the horizon of cooperation with partners in ASEAN in the area of defense industry cooperation, right? Of course, you have the strategic implications from the arms transactions, right? But you could say that at least we try to approach this issue from the economic perspective. And also with defense industry cooperation, we want to kind of help Southeast Asian partners to be better prepared regarding the security challenges in that region. So I don't think there is a sharp strategic edge from the Korean side regarding defense industry cooperation. You mentioned the common exercise, defense education. Well, I think one of the elements, policy elements of Korea's approach under the NSP, you have very strong element of official development assistance, ODA. Usually ODA projects are in the area of economic infrastructure and development area. But you also have the maritime capacity building support. For example, Korea Navy provided used the Coast Guard ships and to Vietnam and other countries. So I think this is in line with the other countries like the United States, Japan, and Australia, which try to coordinate the supporting the military, the maritime capacity building support. So on a bilateral basis, I think Korea is doing its own homework. And also, I think I mentioned the FUNUP operation, right? A lot of U.S. allies and partner countries are participating in U.S. FUNUP in Southeast Asia, but I don't think Korea is able to do that. But I think we already sent the Navy ships to the Gulf of the Aden, the coast of Aden area and the counter terrorism activities. So I think in terms of the HADR, the humanitarian assist and disaster relief, I think Korea is more than willing to expand the cooperation, which has far-reaching the implications, strategic implications. And also Quad Plus, I don't think Korea, for the time being, is able to join the Quad Plus. I mean, John, you mentioned that President Moon officially endorsed U.S. Indo-Pacific initiative when President Trump visited Seoul before he had a brief summit meeting with Kim Jong-un, right? So, of course, I mean, I think we don't have any problem. Actually, the basic tenets and principles of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy serves Korea's national interest. But the problem is you have the geopolitical constraints. I mean, Korea is located geographically right next to China, right? So over the thousands of history, we have many ups and downs, good times and bad times with China. So we are very cautious about that. So I think this is kind of a constraint on what we are willing and able to do or not. But I think Korea basically agrees with the basic, that has the same interest in with other countries like the United States and other Western countries in pushing forward with the Indo-Pacific strategy. But for now, the joining Quad Plus, that's out of the question. I think Minister Gang, the Foreign Minister Gang, when she had a webinar with ASEAN Society, explicitly mentioned about that. She mentioned that the grouping that naturally target a particular country would not be desirable. So that indicates that I think Korean government is not really interested in joining Quad Plus for now. Mekong, I think Korea has put lots of efforts and resources on Mekong cooperation, actually. Last year, as John mentioned, at the on the sidelines of Korea-ASEAN Commemorative Summit in Busan, we had a first ROK Korea-Mekong Summit. So the primary priority of Korea's approach toward Mekong is to share Korea's experience as a kind of the advanced developing countries, right? We have gone through the ashes of Korean War. So we know, we understand the challenges and hardships of developing countries. So we, as a middle power, willing to do the regional roles and responsibilities in the international community, we try to share our developmental experience with countries, with partner countries who need them. So the primary focus of Korea's approach toward Mekong is to help Mekong countries to fill in the developmental gaps, right? So you have a huge economic developmental gap between the advanced ASEAN countries and CLMB countries, right? So I don't think, of course, Mekong, you have some thorny strategic issues going on regarding the water security and things like that. But I think Korea, that sort of the strategic kind of calculation is out of the equation, at least on the part of Korea. We try to expand the cooperation and try to contribute to the economic growth of the countries in the Mekong region. Okay.
There's not a great deal for me to add here, but I would just sort of endorse what Professor Cho was saying. On the first question, Antoine, that you raised about the role of other countries, two things that sort of link together my areas of interest and your reference to Taiwan is the internal debate that is taking place in Japan at the moment under the new Suga administration, with increasing numbers of younger members of the Liberal Democratic Party taking a much tougher position on China. Of course, we have a new defense minister, Mr. Kishi, who has long been aligned with the Taiwan lobby in the Japanese lower house. The question of how the status of Taiwan will affect the policy of other countries. Japan, of course, has been a very active participant in a much more strengthened security partnership with the United States. Through its redefinition of collective security, now able to really project power much more broadly, not just with the United States, but of course with other actors. And I think that reflects a divergence between this more, much more engaged approach to thinking in terms of maritime security. Obviously for Japan, it's much more focused on the East China Sea. But even more broadly, I think we're seeing with the increase in defense expenditure and the appetite on the part of the outgoing Abe administration to do more in this area, a gap between countries like Japan and South Korea, where the South Koreans are much more, I think, naturally cautious because of all the reasons that have been rehearsed. In the case of European actors and what they might do with South Korea, this is, I think, a relatively underdeveloped area. It was the British government, of course, that deployed 2 British frigates to work with their Japanese counterparts in helping to deal with proliferation challenges associated with North Korea. And while critics of British foreign policy have argued that we lack a strategic vision to match our ambitious rhetorical pronouncements of global Britain, we have been able, the United Kingdom government has been able, I think, to demonstrate that it's willing to put real resources into supporting other like-minded actors in the region. South Korea-British security partnership is perhaps an area that could be expanded, but again, it will depend on harmonizing our common interests. In the case of the South Pacific, two initiatives that I would single out where South Korea has been, I think, quite active in providing, last year, $5.2 million worth of assistance to ASEAN countries and Pacific Islands to combat COVID-19, but also about $2 million worth of assistance to deal with climate prediction, which of course has a huge impact in terms of the human security costs for those Pacific Islands. I think one of the important questions when we talk about arms sales in Southeast Asia is to what extent, as I kind of alluded to in my opening remarks, that sort of active economic military collaboration undercuts the rhetoric of people, prosperity and peace. If you can be accused of being a little hypocritical is too strong a term, but at least self-interested, then what does it do to the kind of salience and prominence of those sorts of rhetorical statements? In the case of the Mekong area, here I think the opportunities, again to echo what Professor Che was saying, is for closer cooperation between South Korea and the United States. The United States, which last year provided $55 million, I think, to support law enforcement and justice initiatives in the Mekong area. It's possible that there is room for partnership with South Korea. South Korean National Police Agency has worked with counterparts in the Philippines and Thailand, and that could be expanded as part of this sort of initiative. And also the second area, water resources management. Again, it was with America taking the lead that the Water Resources Management Center was set up in the region. And I understand that the South Koreans have been quite active in providing analytical support to deal with the security implications of boundary disputes involving access to water. So once again, if we take a broad inclusive view of security, South Korea is already doing, I think, a lot in collaboration with other countries. Finally, on the question of freedom of navigation operations, a little kind of reported event in 2018, a South Korean anti-piracy vessel came within striking distance of Chinese island territories in the South China Sea and was roundly criticized by Beijing for this. The position of the South Korean government, I'm not clear about. Perhaps Professor Che knows more about this event, but it highlights, I think, one of the kind of unpredictable elements in all of this, that sometimes, even if for good practical strategic reasons, South Korea doesn't want to get involved in these sorts of formal exercises, the fact that South Korean vessels are transiting this increasingly insecure part of the world may mean that South Korea, whether it likes it or not, gets drawn into some of these conflicts and needs to have a clear position. Strategic ambiguity makes sense, but there are limits to how far that can, I think, be deployed effectively.
Thank you very much. I will gather a last round of questions, including one actually related to North Korea. Southeast Asia is actually the only region in which all countries have diplomatic relation with North Korea, unlike Europe, Africa, or other part of the world. North Korea has quite a lot of embassies in the region and vice versa, including Vietnamese, Indonesian, etc. embassies in North Korea. How do you see the more proactive role that ASEAN could play related to North Korea? From sanction implementation maybe to convincing North Korea to start a denuclearization process. What could be the leverages, I would say, that South Korea could use in ASEAN regarding North Korea? And then another very short question related to what Sophie Boisseau-Durocher asked on the economic versus the political aspect, and stating rightly that the Secretariat of the ASEAN was not delivering that much on the political level. And the key question is, how can Seoul, I would say, overcome this kind of political deadlock with the ASEAN as an institution? And I will ask you to maybe answer in no more than 2 minutes each. And then I will ask you a very final question on the potential and what should be done between EU and Korea in terms of cooperation in the Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Regarding ASEAN's role about DPRK, I think Korea has two kinds of expectations. The first one is that you need to socialize DPRK, right? So in order to engage DPRK, you need to increase the channels of interaction exchanges, right? So I think because overall ASEAN countries maintain good working relationship with DPRK, we expect ASEAN to play the role of mediating DPRK with international community. For example, Vietnam or some other members of ASEAN who has good relationship with DPRK could organize a meeting inviting both Koreans and North Koreans and South Koreans. So in this way, you kind of increase the chances of DPRK's exposure to international community. The other issue is that, well, I think this is related to when the nuclear issue is resolved, right? When North Korea confronts the economic reform and the economic opening, right? I think Southeast Asian countries have some experience. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, right? They have transition experience from the socialist, the closed economy to opening up. So we expect down the road in the future, Vietnam and other member countries of ASEAN could provide expertise and help to North Koreans. Regarding the political deadlock, the second question about ASEAN Secretariat. Well, you know that the ways in which ASEAN works is quite different from the European Union works, right? So you have different kind of type of regional integration. So the so-called ASEAN way. So we understand the issues and challenges and difficulties, right? But I think ASEAN as a whole is a huge success for all the ASEAN member countries. If you look at the trajectories of ASEAN, right? You don't have any sort of internal conflicts among ASEAN members. And also ASEAN is now the major convener of regional politics, EAS, ASEAN +3, and things like that. So I think we don't feel particular problem with that. We try to kind of expand the cooperation with ASEAN and work together toward building what is called the East Asian community. Well, regarding the EU ROK cooperation regarding Southeast Asia, I think there are a lot of areas to coordinate, cooperate. I know that the European countries are trying negotiating the dialogue partnership with ASEAN. I think we did have that kind of experience, and I think we need to think about some of the practical, functional areas of cooperation. I think there are a lot of overlaps between what Koreans and Europeans are doing in Southeast Asia. So I think we might have some sort of a dialogue on that and try to expand the areas of cooperation. Okay.
And just a very, very short question as a follow-up. What is the official Korea position on the South China Sea? We mentioned the law of the sea before, etc. What would be the official position of Korea?
Then let me give you the 3 elements of official statement. Well, actually, the basic approach, Korea's approach about South China Sea is silent diplomacy. You don't speak, you shut up. So, but I mean, officially, we think it is very important to have the freedom of navigation and overflight. And also the dispute should be resolved in peaceful way. And also international norms and established rules and norms should be respected. So that's the official line. But as I pointed out in my presentation, I think Korea's existing stance of keeping technical neutrality between China and US, I think this is increasingly difficult to maintain down the road, because I mean, Korea has critical stake in South China Sea, the slot issue, right? But you keep silent. You don't you don't criticize some of the law-breaking behaviors of China, right? So I mean, in the end, at the end of the day, this sort of taking a silent stance is implicitly supporting Chinese stance. That's my personal perspective. So I think Korea has increasing kind of challenges regarding the maintaining its position on South China Sea. So I think we need to, because you have increasing rivalry between the two, US and China, right? So I think Korea need to examine the existing approach and come up with a more constructive, more engaging approach. I don't know what that is, but I think we need to think about that. That's my 2 cents about South China Sea.
Very quickly, because I know we don't have much time. On North Korea, yes, I would sort of endorse what Professor Cho was saying about Southeast Asian countries as mediators. Also, obviously, a venue, given the relative success of Singapore, but the failure of Hanoi. I mean, this, I suppose, will continue to be a geographical space where one might expect future visits. I mentioned sustainable development goals. If you think about the ones that North Korea has identified with, zero hunger, clean water and sanitation, clean energy, sustainable cities, responsible consumption and production, all of this dovetails very nicely with much of South Korea's ASEAN collaboration. So if the North Koreans are serious, and that's a big if, not only did they announce their commitment to those goals as part of its five-year plan, the North Korean state's 5-year plan back in 2017, but they had attendees in Vladivostok in 2019. This may be an opportunity. On the question of what the Europeans might do with South Korea, periodically European states have to explore the possibility, as they did during the high point of fire and fury, of evacuating their own citizens from the peninsula. Those sorts of evacuation plans have long been considered, going back to the 1970s, I think, according to British archives. But of course, there are other areas where I think there are natural areas for cooperation. Britain, for example, with its new cybersecurity centre, could work closely with the South Koreans in addressing those vulnerabilities as they relate to North Korea, but also, of course, to other states, Russia, and to a lesser extent, China. Proliferation initiatives, I mentioned the collaboration between Britain and Japan, and the legacy of institutional innovations like PSI, this will continue to be a problem because there's no evidence that the North Koreans are going to do anything meaningful in the short term to draw down their nuclear stockpiles. And as the economic pressure bites, of course, the incentive, the pressure on Pyongyang to export some of this material, or at least if it's not nuclear fissile material, to think in terms of weapon sales. All of these are areas where there needs to be much more active cooperation. And at the same time, declaratory policy, very important for Europeans like Britain and France, of course, who've taken a strong position on maintaining the sanctions regime, for there to be, you know, the problem of South Korean ambiguity, not only as it relates to the South China Sea, but also how the Moon administration balances its engagement strategy with a firm and unambiguous support for the international sanctions regime. How much divergence there is between European players and Seoul is important in that context. If one's thinking of engagement, here there may be scope for greater cooperation both between Southeast Asia and South Korea and European actors in thinking about how you sustain long-term engagement between North Koreans and Southeast Asians and Europeans. As liberal open societies, whatever the position of our governments, our educational institutions are relatively free, varying from country to country, to maintain those links. But the critical constraint has often been funding. So imaginative ways in which long-term funding can be provided, whether by foundations or private sector initiatives. And last, we haven't talked much about the ASEM process and whether that provides a framework in which some of these sorts of ideas can be more actively discussed. On your point about breaking the ASEAN deadlock, I'm not sure what any country can do, given the priority placed on non-intervention as part of the ASEAN way, whether that's South Korea or other actors, in terms of creating a more integrated approach on the part of ASEAN. We are, of course, seeing with the discussion about the Quad, efforts, at least under the Trump administration, to develop a much more substantive security framework in Northeast Asia and more broadly. And that brings me back to the question of Japan-Korea relations. Will a Biden administration, by reverting to past policy and given the suggested prominence of former members of the Obama administration, like Tony Blinken and others, who've had long experience of dealing with officials in both South Korea and Japan, will the United States be more in a position to try and broker and mediate? We talked about mediation in the context of both South Korean policy and in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. How important is it to mediate between these two US allies? And what role might Europeans play behind the scenes to reinforce those sorts of messages?
Thank you very much. So we are running behind schedules. I will stop here. Thank you very much to our two excellent panelists. Thank you also for the question we received in the Q&A box. And I give back the floor to Francois Nicola, I guess, for the concluding remarks. And thank you very much.
Yes, I will. I will keep my concluding remarks to the minimum because we're really running behind schedule. I would like to thank you all, well, to thank all of you for your very active participation in the discussion. I think it was quite interesting. I think we understand this NSP strategy slightly better now, but there is still some more work to do, and well, we will publish something at the Center for Asian Studies precisely on this strategy, and so to make things even clearer, hopefully. Well, so thank you. Have a nice day, everybody. Nice evening for our Korean friends, since it's already quite late in the afternoon. So thank you, and we'll reconvene at some point for other events from the Center for Asian Studies here at Ifri. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.